Before I tell you what kind of woman my wife is, I need you to understand something. She has never once in 31 years of marriage asked me to choose between her and my family. Not once. She would sooner quietly suffer than cause any friction between me and the people I grew up with. That is just who she is, and for a long time I took that for granted. Not cruelly, not intentionally, but I took it for granted the way you take for granted a warm house in February. You don't think about the furnace until the heat stops coming. The heat stopped coming last Christmas. My wife's name is Catherine. She is 54 years old. She taught elementary school for 22 years before her knees started giving her real trouble, and she moved to a part-time reading support role at the same school. She gardens in the summer. She makes her own bread. On Sunday mornings, she sits at the kitchen table in Brockville with a cup of Earl Grey and the crossword from the Recorder and Times, and she does the whole thing in pen. She has never once left a blank square. Our son Marcus... Wait, no, that name's been used. Our son's name is Colin. He is 29. He works in project management for a construction firm in Ottawa. 3 years ago, he married a woman named Petra. Petra grew up outside of Toronto, came from what she always described as a very particular kind of upbringing, which I came to understand meant that her mother ran a tight, performative household where appearances mattered more than effort, and effort mattered more than kindness. Petra is not a bad person. I want to be fair about that. But she had grown up watching other people do things for her mother, and somewhere along the way, she had decided that was simply how things worked. Catherine welcomed Petra from the beginning. I mean that. She drove to Ottawa the weekend after Colin proposed and spent 2 days helping Petra find a dress she liked for the engagement photos. She organized the bridal shower at our house. She spent $400 on flowers alone because Petra had mentioned once in passing that she liked white peonies. Catherine did these things without being asked and without keeping score. That was her nature, and I think looking back now, that Petra mistook that nature for an unlimited resource. The first Christmas after the wedding, we hosted at our place in Brockville. Everyone came to us. My wife cooked for 14 hours over 2 days, and it was extraordinary. Nobody said thank you. Not formally, not with any weight behind it. Colin said, "This is great, Mom," while looking at his phone, and Petra made a comment about the gravy being a little thick, which Catherine laughed off. I didn't say anything. I should have. That was my first failure. The second Christmas, Petra and Colin hosted at their place in Ottawa and ordered in from a Lebanese restaurant, which was fine, actually excellent, though Petra felt the need to tell everyone 3 separate times how difficult it had been to coordinate. Catherine smiled and said it was delicious and meant it. Then came this past year. In October, Petra sent Catherine a text. Catherine showed it to me one evening while I was watching the Senators game with the sound low. She handed me her phone without saying anything. I read it twice. The text said that this Christmas, they were going to do a proper family dinner at their place in Ottawa, Colin and Petra's place, and that it was going to be a real occasion because they had invited Petra's parents and her sister's family, which brought the total up to 22 people. The text then listed, in numbered point form, the dishes she was hoping Catherine could bring. Roast turkey with stuffing, glazed ham, mashed potatoes, roasted root vegetables, a green bean casserole, dinner rolls made from scratch, 2 pies, 1 pumpkin, 1 apple, and a batch of shortbread cookies. 9 items. For 22 people. And then the last line of the text said, "We're thinking around noon for arrival, so probably starting your prep the day before would make the most sense." I read it again. Then I looked up at my wife. She was standing in the doorway of the living room with her arms crossed loosely, and a look on her face I can only describe as exhausted resignation, like she had already talked herself halfway into doing it and was just waiting to see what I would say. I said, "Catherine." She said, "I know." I turned the TV off. I said, "This is 9 dishes, for 22 people, at someone else's house." She said, "I know, Doug." I said, "Did she ask if you were even available? Did she ask if your knees were up for a 2-day cooking marathon? Did she ask anything?" Catherine sat down on the arm of the couch and looked at the floor for a second. Then she said, "She probably just assumed. That's exactly the problem," I said. There was a long quiet. Outside, the neighbor was running a snowblower. It was only October, and we'd already had one early dump that stuck around, the way it does in eastern Ontario. My wife looked at me and said very gently, like she was afraid of my reaction, "I don't want to cause a thing between you and Colin." And that right there, that sentence, that was the sentence that sat in my chest for the next 3 weeks. Because she was protecting me, even now. Even after being handed a catering order by her daughter-in-law, with zero acknowledgement of what it would take to fulfill it, her first instinct was to protect me from conflict with my own son. I turned 58 years old in November, and standing in that living room in October, I understood for the first time with real clarity that my wife had been doing this our entire married life, and I had been letting her. Catherine texted back a non-answer. Something polite and vague about, "We'll see how things are looking closer to the date." Petra responded with a thumbs up emoji. That was the whole exchange. I said nothing more about it that night. But I didn't stop thinking. I called my friend Dennis a few days later. Dennis and his wife Lorraine have been friends of ours since before Colin was born. We met them at a Canada Day barbecue in 1997 and have been close ever since. Dennis is the kind of person who says exactly what is on his mind in a way that is blunt without being unkind. I told him about the text. He said, "What did Catherine say?" I said, "She's already trying to figure out if she can do it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Doug, you know what that text is, right? That's a work order. Your daughter-in-law sent your wife a work order." I didn't say anything. He said, 9 dishes, Doug. From scratch. 2 pies. You know what that is? That's 2 full days of labor in their kitchen for their guests, half of whom are Petra's family." I said, "I know." He said, "What are you going to do about it?" I drove home from Dennis's place, and I sat in the truck in the driveway for a while before going inside. It was dark by 4:30 now, the way it gets in November in this part of the country. The maple in the front yard had dropped everything. Catherine had raked it twice already, and there were still leaves collecting against the garage door. I sat in that truck and I made a decision. I did not tell Catherine right away. I needed to plan it properly, and I needed to be sure I was doing the right thing, not just the satisfying thing. Those are not always the same, and I am old enough to know the difference. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that they were, in this case, the same thing. I called Lorraine. Lorraine and Dennis have a place in Ucluelet on the west side of Vancouver Island. A small house, nothing fancy, right up near the water. They'd been talking for years about renting it out over the holidays to generate some income because they spent most of December with Lorraine's family in Winnipeg. I'd been there twice in the summer, and it was the kind of place that makes you slow down whether you want to or not. I asked Lorraine if the house was available for the week of Christmas. She said, "Doug, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm taking Catherine somewhere quiet." There was a pause. Then she said, "Hold on," and I heard her call Dennis, and he picked up the other phone, and the 3 of us talked for about 40 minutes. By the end of it, Lorraine said we could have the house for free. I told her I wouldn't accept that. We settled on a number that was fair to everyone. I booked the flights the next morning. WestJet, direct from Ottawa, because we were driving to Ottawa to drop off the dog with Colin anyway. That had been the plan from the beginning. We were flying out of Ottawa on the 23rd of December and coming back on the 30th. A week on the west coast. 7 days of salt air and no obligation. I bought Catherine a new rain jacket because Ucluelet is not the kind of place where you go unprepared for weather. I told her 3 weeks before we left. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, her with the crossword, me with coffee. I put the printed confirmation page down beside her cup. She looked at it. She picked it up. She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully and looked at me across the table. She said, "Doug." I said, "We're going." She said, "What about Christmas?" I said, "We're having Christmas in Ucluelet." She looked at the paper again. She said, "Colin and Petra." I said, "Colin and Petra can figure out Christmas." Her eyes went a little glassy, not from sadness. I know the difference after 31 years. She said, "When did you do all this?" I said, "November." She laughed, just a small sound, and pressed her fingers to her mouth for a second. Then she said, "What about Rufus?" Rufus is our dog, 11-year-old beagle, mostly gray around the muzzle now but still gets excited about car rides. I said, "We'll drop him with Colin when we drive up on the 23rd. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said quietly, "He's going to be upset." She didn't mean the dog. I said, "I know," and I meant it. I was not doing this to punish Colin. I was doing it because my wife deserved to be chosen, and I had spent too many years choosing comfort and silence over that. I wrote the note on the 22nd of December. Catherine was packing in the bedroom, and I sat at the kitchen table with the notepad we keep on the counter for grocery lists. I wrote slowly. I said that we were spending Christmas on Vancouver Island with friends, and that we hoped everyone had a wonderful holiday. I said that Catherine had worked very hard over many years to make every gathering special for our family, and that this year we had decided to rest. I said there was no bad feeling in this, no anger, only a recognition that some things had been taken for granted, and that we hoped the new year would bring a chance to talk about that honestly. I said Rufus would need his heartworm pill on the 27th, and that his food was in the bag we'd left by the door. I folded it and put it on the kitchen table. We drove to Ottawa on the 23rd. Dropped Rufus at Colin's door. My son came out in socks despite the cold and took the leash and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I told him to check the bag. There was a note with care instructions. He said, "Okay," I hugged him. He hugged me back, a little stiff, the way young men hug their fathers when something feels off but they can't name it. I said, "Merry Christmas, son." He said, "Yeah, you too, Dad." We drove to the airport. The flight was smooth. We got into Tofino late and drove the rental down the dark coast road to Ucluelet with the windows cracked, and Catherine leaned her head back and closed her eyes, and I could hear the ocean before we even parked. The house smelled like cedar and a little bit like the sea. Lorraine had left a bottle of Okanagan Red on the counter and a handwritten note that said simply, "You two deserve this." We opened the wine and sat on the small covered porch in our coats and listened to the water. It was cold but not brutal. The way the coast gets in December, a damp cold with no real bite to it. The lights were off behind us. There was nothing but the sound of the waves. Catherine said, "I haven't felt this in a long time." I said, "What?" She thought for a moment. Then she said, "Like I don't owe anyone anything right now." I didn't answer that. I just reached over and held her hand. Colin called on the afternoon of December 24th. I was down on the beach with Catherine, walking the long curve of sand near the mouth of the inlet. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, and I looked at the screen and showed it to her. She said, "You should answer it." I answered it. My son's voice was tight. Not angry, exactly, but tight the way a wire gets when it's carrying more than it should. He said, "Dad, what is going on?" "Petra's family is arriving tomorrow. We have 22 people for Christmas dinner, and Mom's not here." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, "We did, Colin. Your mother sent a message in October saying she wasn't sure she could manage it. Nobody followed up." There was a pause. He said, She didn't say no." I said she shouldn't have had to say no to a 9-item catering list in the first place. Another pause. Longer. The waves were coming in and going out. Catherine had walked a few steps ahead of me and was looking out at the water with her hands in her pockets. He said, "This feels like a punishment." I said, "It isn't one. Your mother and I are on vacation. We needed one." "This is not directed at you," he said. "Petra is really stressed." I said, "I understand. There's a good grocery store in Westboro. Hubert does a full holiday meal with all the sides. They have to be ordered ahead, but it might be worth calling." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I can't believe you're suggesting we order St. Hubert's for Christmas dinner." I said, "I can't believe your wife sent your mother a 9-item cooking list for a dinner that included 22 people, half of whom are strangers to your mother, with no question about whether she was willing or able." The line was very quiet. He said, "Mom always does this stuff." And there it was, the whole thing, in 5 words. I said, "I know she does, Colin, and that's exactly what I'm trying to tell you." He didn't have an answer for that. We talked for a few more minutes, nothing of substance. He was upset and working through it in real time, and I was not going to pile on. I loved my son. I was not trying to wound him, but I was also done protecting him from the consequences of the household he'd allowed to develop. We hung up. I caught up to Catherine on the beach. She didn't ask what he'd said. I told her anyway, just the shape of it, not every word. She nodded. Then she said, "Is he okay?" I almost laughed. "Of course she asked that." I said, "He will be." She nodded again and we kept walking. Petra called the next morning, Christmas Day. We were having coffee and watching the light come up over the inlet, a pale gray and silver light, the kind you only get on the coast. My phone lit up on the table between us with Petra's name on the screen. Catherine saw it. I let it ring. It rang again 20 minutes later. I let it ring again. An hour after that, she sent a text. It said, "I want you to know I think what you did is incredibly selfish and you've ruined Christmas for everyone." I read it once. Then I put the phone face down. Catherine said, "What did it say?" I thought about it. Then I said, "She's upset." My wife looked at me for a moment. Then she said she'll be all right. And the way she said it, not cold, not satisfied, just calm, as if she had finally, fully exhaled. That was the moment I knew we had done the right thing. We made Christmas dinner ourselves that day. There were two of us, and we had a small kitchen, and whatever was in the grocery bag we'd packed from home, plus what we found at the little market in town. We made a pot of seafood chowder from scratch. We had sourdough bread that we'd bought the day before. We found a small container of butter tarts at the market. A woman in town made them, sold them in packages of 6, and we had those with coffee after. We sat at a small wooden table by the window with the ocean in front of us, and we ate slowly and talked about things we hadn't talked about in a long time. Old things. Things from before Colin was born, from the early years when we lived in a basement apartment in Kingston and had nothing and were happy anyway. I refilled our coffee, and she told me about a student she'd been working with in the reading support program, a boy of about 7 who had been labeled a slow learner, but who had, over 3 months of quiet work with her, begun to read with genuine pleasure. She said he had asked to borrow a book over the holidays. She said she'd let him. I watched her face while she talked and thought about the note in Petra's kitchen. I thought about the 9-item list and the thumbs-up emoji. I thought about all the Christmas dinners and bridal showers and peonies that had gone acknowledged only in the thinnest, most passing way. And I thought, this woman has been pouring herself into other people's happiness for 31 years. Today, she is just here. She is just with me. She is talking about a boy who learned to read, and she is smiling, and the chowder is getting cold because we're talking and neither of us cares. That was Christmas. Colin called again 3 days after. The tone had shifted. He didn't sound tight anymore. He sounded quieter, a little humbled. He said they'd ordered a full holiday spread from a local caterer in Ottawa. He didn't say St. Hubert's, but I didn't ask, and that it had worked out fine. He said Petra's sister had actually stepped up and done some of the decorating, and that Petra had been surprised by how smoothly it came together. I said, I'm glad to hear it. He said, I've been thinking about what you said, about Mom always doing this stuff. I didn't rush him. He said, I didn't realize how much we just assumed. I said, I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is she there? Can I talk to her? I handed Catherine the phone. I walked out to the porch so they could have some privacy and stood with my hands on the railing, looking at the water. I could hear her voice through the door, low and warm. At some point she laughed, a real one. That sound is the reason I booked the flights in November. We flew home on the 30th, picked up Rufus from Colin's place. He was ecstatic about the car, as always, spinning in small circles on the sidewalk and making his old man grunt. Colin stood in the doorway and hugged his mother for a long time. Longer than usual. Petra was not there. She was at a post-holiday thing with her family, but that was all right. There would be time. On the drive home down the 416, Catherine fell asleep in the passenger seat with her head against the window and Rufus curled across her lap. The radio was low, a classical station out of Ottawa that fades in and out depending on the terrain. The highway was clear, the fields on either side flat and white and enormous. I drove, and I thought about all of it. The text in October, the 9 dishes, the note on the kitchen table, the beach on Christmas Eve. My son's voice going quiet when I said the thing he hadn't wanted to hear. I thought about how close I came to saying nothing, to watching my wife pack up her stand mixer and her good knives and drive to Ottawa on the 23rd to start making rolls from scratch in someone else's kitchen. I thought about how easy it would have been to let it happen, to tell myself it was fine, that Catherine didn't mind, that this was just how families worked. I thought about Catherine saying, I don't owe anyone anything right now, on that dark porch in Ucluelet, and I thought, that is what 31 years of giving without limits sounds like when it finally gets a night off. You teach people how to treat you, but sometimes you do it so quietly, over so many years, that you forget you're the one who wrote the lesson. My wife never complained. She never asked for recognition. She just kept giving, and the people around her kept receiving. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the giving stopped being a choice and started being an expectation. That changed on the 23rd of December, somewhere over the Rockies, when Catherine looked out the plane window at the mountains below and reached over and squeezed my hand without saying a word. The next time we got a list, we would be ready to say something. 1 word, 2 letters, no explanation required. But this one time, I said it with a plane ticket. And I think she heard it loud and clear.